Welcome to another episode of the BioHub. Today I'm with Iain Kilty, the CEO of Sitryx Therapeutics. And we're actually lucky enough to be down in Oxford in their office. So Sitryx are an exciting UK biotech that are making big moves at the moment. Iain has over 25 years in drug discovery, from Pfizer to then smaller biotech startups. Iain's now leading Sitryx into the clinic with some major milestones ahead for these guys. Today, we'll dive into his journey, what it's like running a biotech in the UK, and what's next for Sitryx. So let's dive into it. So, Iain, just tell us about your journey in Biotech and Pharma, and then also what made you join Sitryx, and then eventually how you became CEO.
Great. Well, first of all, great to meet you in person, Max. Thanks for coming down to spend some time with us today. So my journey in biotech, or in Biotech and Pharma, I joined Pfizer actually as an internal industrial postdoc after doing my PhD, doing molecular biology work, using techniques actually which are not really used anymore as things have moved on. But it gave me a great opportunity there in this molecular pharmacology group to start to see the impact you can make with science in driving forward new medicines and so on. And I was quite quickly aligned with the immunology space, and actually that's where I spent my whole career. Initially, first 8 years or so in the UK, and then moved across to Pfizer in the US. It's a fantastic place to learn about drug discovery, to be exposed to everything from early ideas through to clinical development and so on. So in the US, I had a variety of roles there, originally preclinical, and then took on the role leading clinical clusters in rheumatology and dermatology. So that was through phase 2 proof of concept work. And another part of my role there as well was actually interacting a lot with external biotechs and looking at opportunities for Pfizer to in-license and so on. And that gave me the taste for potentially going to biotech, having that opportunity to apply some of the learnings I had from Big Pharma into that nimble biotech space where you could drive things more rapidly, but also take on some of those really big challenges where you need to be able to think about those targets on a day-to-day basis, or that science on a day-to-day basis. So from Pfizer, moved to Atlas Venture, which is a Cambridge, Massachusetts-based venture group. I was working in Cambridge, Mass for Pfizer at the time, and joined Atlas as an entrepreneur in residence. So that was helping them look at new opportunities, help them seed companies and so on. But also as the CSO for a company called Quench Bio, which was in the immunology space at that time. So I had a great experience there before making the jump back to the UK and joining Sitryx almost 4 years ago now, originally as the CSO. So Sitryx, as you know, it's an immunology company focused on targeting metabolic pathways to reset your immune response. So this broad field of immunometabolism. And one of the things that had attracted me is when I was at Pfizer, leading the preclinical groups, a VP for preclinical, one of the groups we'd established within that, or areas of focus, was immunometabolism.
Okay.
Because we felt it had the potential to really reset that immune response and drive more patients into disease remission, and we can talk about that a bit more later. So when the opportunity came to do that on a day-to-day basis, it was already a field that I was aware of. I also had a relationship with one of the founders, Luke O'Neill from Trinity College Dublin, who's somebody that I hugely respect and really enjoy working with. And then when I met the leadership at the time, Neil Weir was the CEO, ex-head of research from UCB and Celltech, I thought this would be a great team to work with here. So came across, joined the team, and it's been a really exciting journey since I arrived here in Oxford.
Yeah, kind of setting the stars. Technology right, team right, often how it works.
Yeah, and I guess the other piece that I'd learned very much from the Atlas experience was that the investor group are right as well. So as you're in Big Pharma, you're not really thinking about these investor groups in the same sort of way, but then you start to realize the importance of those quality investors who are really seasoned in this space. They understand that there'll be highs and lows, and that you need significant proper investment, not eking the investment out, to be able to be successful in this space. That was the other thing that attracted me, that SV Health Investors were the seed investor for Sitryx. So a blue chip investment group based in London. So I had discussions with Kate Bingham, which many people will know because of the vaccine task force and so on. But also Hooman Ashrafian was at SV at the time. He's now head of R&D at Sanofi. But chatting to those guys, they gave me real confidence in the company and how they saw the vision for the company. But then we also have other great investors in Sofanova. We have Maina Barman from there, Rich Aldrich from Longwood, and a couple of strategic investors in Lilly and GSK. So that was the other piece to the jigsaw for me, the science, the team, and the right investor base to allow you to be successful, knowing drug discovery is hard.
Yeah.
And you want those people who are seasoned and are going to come on the journey with you.
Yeah, often a good sign.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you guys, you're focused on autoimmune and inflammatory diseases.
Yeah.
Why those? Why did you go down that route? And also, why is it important to Sitryx?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of reasons. It's where the science fits. There's medical need there, and the science fits really well. So if we talk first about the medical need there, I think there's been great strides in being able to help patients with autoimmune disease and chronic inflammatory diseases, and it's come in different waves. The first wave were really broad immunosuppressants that had actually often been chemotherapeutics that had been repositioned, like methotrexate, like steroids and so on. So these are good anti-inflammatories, but they bring a lot of toxicity along with them. The next wave was really around some of the biologics and things which give you the opposite of that broad immunosuppression, very targeted effects, things like the anti-TNFs, Humira, and the biggest selling drugs in the world for many years, which have been transformational for patients. If you've got RA now, it's much less likely that you're going to have deformities from this because of biologic treatments like the anti-TNFs. But there's still a limitation for those drugs, even in the diseases where they work well, where only a small percentage of people, 20 to 30%, depending on how you look at it, achieve sustained remission. And so if you're an RA patient who's 50% better, well, you're still 50% better. It does improve your day-to-day experience, but you're still going to have some swollen joints and some pain, which is going to be somewhat debilitating. So there's a need for those patients to drive more of those patients into remission over time and do this in a way that's not broadly immunosuppressive to bring all the side effects. And then there's other diseases like lupus, for example, where there are drugs for patients with lupus, but unfortunately many lupus patients are still on high doses of drugs like steroids, prednisolone and so on to try and control their disease, and that brings all the side effects that prednisolone has. So there's a lot of medical need in some of these other diseases that are perhaps a bit more heterogeneous, where we really struggle to drive the efficacy forward. So the bottom line here is there's a lot of medical need and opportunity to really make a difference. And then what we found is by targeting metabolic pathways, we can reset the phenotype of inflammatory cells. So we're not broadly immunosuppressive. What we're doing is we're taking effector cells, which are often driving the disease phenotype, and we're limiting their ability to expand and generate cytokines and so on in inflammatory sites. And then the other piece to these metabolic pathways is they're really context dependent. So the impact, is context dependent. And what do I mean by that? So what happens with inflammatory cells when they go to inflammatory sites? You'll find the environment at those inflammatory sites is very different to the blood. So in the blood, there'll be lots of extracellular amino acids, often high oxygen levels and so on. But in an inflammatory site, you'll have reduced amino acids extracellularly because the cells have used them up as they proliferate and make cytokines. It's often hypoxic. You'll often have reduced glucose levels. So the environment's really different. And under those conditions, that's when inflammatory cells start to use metabolic pathways, partly to generate energy, but actually more importantly, to provide the building blocks to make these amino acids and then hence nucleotides and so on required for proliferation, cytokine production and so on, which are depleted extracellularly. So what you find then is if you're choosing the right targets, and we do that with some of our founders in particular who are real experts in the space, that these targets are specifically upregulated at these inflammatory sites to allow the access to these building blocks. Whilst you have an oral therapy in our case, the pharmacology only reveals itself in the right cellular context. So what that allows is an oral therapy that isn't broadly immunosuppressive, but in inflammatory sites is going to reveal pharmacology and drive an anti-inflammatory response. And so the potential there is that we can drive more patients into remission. And it's just a really exciting space to work right now.
Yeah.
When we were first setting up a group doing this sort of work at Pfizer, and then even when I was first at Sitryx, this was all a hypothesis that this would be true. We've certainly shown this preclinically now, that we can reset the phenotype of inflammatory cells, and we do this in a context-specific manner. And depending on the type of inflammatory cell, the context will be different, the target will be different. And now we're at that exciting point of moving our internal lead program into the clinic, hopefully in the next month or so, to say, well, does this translate clinically? And we do have a partner program with Eli Lilly that's completed phase 1 last year, so we know the safety is good now, and hopefully we'll progress to phase 2 this year. So we're going to learn in the next year, 18 months, whether this whole preclinical thesis translates clinically to provide benefit to patients. But we're pretty confident it will and excited to find out.
Yeah, I think that's all so interesting. But also there was something you said earlier on in that you said like there's a medical need in this space. I'm just interested, like what normally comes first? Do you see a gap where you're like, yeah, there's a medical need there, what's the potential solution? Or do you come up with, this concept and you go, well, can we actually apply that? Like, does it differ, or how does?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of both with these things. So if we find particular pathways that we think are important in driving inflammatory cell phenotypes. So, for example, our lead program is a modulator of a target called PKM2. Yeah. It's an enzyme involved in glycolysis. It's the last enzyme in glycolysis, or it catalyzes the last step in glycolysis. What we find is by modulating that target, we have a profound effect on T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. So then what we look at is, well, which subtypes of those cells we're having the bigger effect? And here, just as an example, we see a really strong effect in a cell type called Th2 lymphocytes, which are involved in diseases like atopic dermatitis, like asthma, and so on, and allergies generally. So the way we then think about that is, well, if we know that's the phenotype of this approach, this is what our drugs could do. They could really modulate an inflammation driven by these particular cells. Yeah. What are the key diseases where these cells are driving pathology, and where is the biggest medical need there? So then we can apply the science to where the medical need is. And then frankly, for a small company as well, we need to think about what's the disease area that we focus on that will allow us to get a relatively early clinical read to say, actually, there's a there. This mechanism is translating. Mm-hmm. Because unfortunately, through my career, we've cured lots of things in mice, asthma, RA, all sorts of stuff. Doesn't necessarily always translate to humans. Yeah. So we try and build as much human translational data for that relevant disease, and then try and get that early clinical read. Because there's nothing quite like that when you get that early clinical data, and I've been lucky enough to be involved in a few programs where we've also seen this, where suddenly you've got a really clear signal. And you think, actually, this is working, and then this has potential to really change patients' lives. So for that lead program, PKM2, the indication we've chosen is atopic dermatitis. There's a clear medical nexus. There's a clear medical need there. Again, a biologic in that space, Dupixent, really changed the field for the patients. Before that, the patients who had moderate to severe disease, they can't really control it just with topical therapies. They really had to rely on pretty broad systemic immunosuppressants that brought all the side effects. Dupixent's a biologic. It targets a common receptor for IL-4 and IL-13 signaling, and it has been transformational for patients. But there's some limitations. For that drug, about 50% of patients get a 75% improvement. So there's still a lot of medical need there. But also it's an injectable. A lot of patients would prefer orals because that's just more convenient. And often people transition from topical. It's a big step to now say we're going to get an injection every couple of weeks or whatever that might be. And so that's where we focused our PKM2 program initially in atopic dermatitis. And then the other opportunity we have, relating back to what I was saying about getting that early clinical read, is this translating, is that we can run a phase 1b study as part of our phase 1. So phase 1a will be purely PK safety in healthy volunteers. 1b primaries, again, will be PK and safety, but in atopic dermatitis patients. But if we run that for an appropriate period of time, we can get a readout on, are we seeing this clinical efficacy translate? Being a dermatological disease, we can also do tape strips and so on, so we can access the tissue and say, is this biology translating? And from there, we can expand into multiple other indications. So a number of things are going into our thinking about how we're choosing that lead indication. But yeah, clearly it's medical need, how the biology fits the known pathology of disease, and then it's, can we get a read on this with a relatively sensible level of investment?
Yeah, the strategy aspect is actually really interesting behind like all the science. But I actually want to move it on a little bit.
Yeah.
You've got this unique experience where you've been in the US, you've seen big pharma, you've seen smaller biotech on that side of things, and now back in the UK. What are the differences? But also like, what are the challenges and advantages to being a biotech in the UK emerging?
Yeah, so it was great to have the opportunity to start my career in the UK, as I said, to then went to the US, worked with Pfizer for 7 or 8 years out in the US, and then moved across to Atlas, working biotech for a period of time in the US before coming back. I think both have different advantages, like pharma and biotech. There's I think pharma brings a huge amount to the table. There's nothing quite like the pharma machine. Once you get into the clinic and you got something that's working, you're just kind of like surfing on a wave and driving things forward. Biotech's more nimble and allows you to make those sort of focused decisions quite quickly and really go after some of these really tough target spaces where you just don't need the distractions of managing the machine of the bigger company. But the US to UK piece, I think the UK has a huge amount of talent and particularly academic talent, identifying novel targets and so on in this space, which is right to be to take advantage of, to try and make new medicines that can really help people in the UK. The US is probably a bit more advanced in that growth curve through biotech. Places like Cambridge, Mass, where I was based in Tech Square, within a couple of square miles, there's literally hundreds of companies.
Yeah.
And so you can learn a huge amount from working in that environment and how the different companies interact, the different strategies companies are using from a business perspective, from a scientific perspective. And there's a huge energy that comes from that, which is great. Some of that, I think, is happening in the UK. The ecosystem's a bit smaller here, and it's a little bit more dispersed, perhaps. Because obviously in the US, you've got those big hubs of Boston and the San Diego, San Francisco areas and so on, which are obviously quite distant. But that hub of Boston, where I was based, it brings a huge amount of energy in itself. Whereas here we have a bit more of the Golden Triangle and so on. But there's groups like BIA who do a fantastic job of trying to bring biotech together here and try and build those networks and learn from some of that US experience. I think some of the things we have to learn as Brits is Brits are naturally a bit understated. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's absolutely true. And when it comes to funding and so on, that's a global market. So, when I see the pictures I was used to working in the US, they'd be much more bullish than some of the pictures I'll see here. So part of my role actually is also as a venture partner with SB Health Investors. So we get to see investors pictures from both Europe and the US pretty regularly, and it's really quite stark. Brits will often put maybe, potentially, possibly in titles, whereas the American teams are going to be much more, this is how we're going to cure Alzheimer's. Or
Yes.
and I think, you can say, well, that's fine, you should understand that. But there's always a discount that you put on some of those statements, because it's science, it's drug discovery, it's hard. You'll see whether that comes through. But if you already start off a bit understated, it probably doesn't help you too much. So I think there's an element of, but on a more sort of general front or more fundamental front, there's an element of us just being a bit more bullish over here sometimes and just going for it, which I think the American ecosystem does pretty well. But all those things said, it's been great to become immersed in the UK biotech system as I've come back. People like some of those investors I mentioned earlier have been super generous in introducing me to people over here, because I didn't have much of a biotech network at all when I came back. It was more pharma. Yeah. And so that's been great to be able to do that. And then others like Neil, who was the previous CEO and now president. He's spent the majority of all his career really in the UK, so he's very well connected and it's been great. But having been back 4 years, I feel I'm pretty well connected again now.
Yeah. How have you actually found the fundraising aspect being in the UK? Did it differ in any way? And also, You mentioned the Eli Lilly partnership.
Yeah.
How's that helped
Yeah.
on that front?
Yeah, well, I think the Eli Lilly partnership helps on two levels. One is it's great validation to have a big pharma like Lilly say, we believe enough in your science and the quality of what you're doing to invest in your company. And then now in 23, they opted in so that they decided that they would fully take over and drive forward the Attack-innate mimetic program, which is the program I mentioned that's just finished phase 1. So that's great validation. It also obviously brings non-dilutive cash into the company, which is super valuable for us. It's allowed us to build out our team, build out our expertise. And then the other thing that it's great as we go forward in the future, in that we have potential milestones as this progresses to bring more funding in. And then when investors are looking at investing in us, it's not a huge part of the financial decision, but they realize there may be some dollars that will come in addition to the dollars they're putting into the company, which is valuable. Probably the validation's the more important part there. When it comes to raising funds, I guess there's a couple of reflections. So I'd only really been through that process once in the US with Quench when we were running a Series A, but that was in 2019. And in 2019, things were really frothy and hot, and it was a lot easier to raise money, frankly. And that was a pretty early company as the fourth employee, where we were really selling a concept more than having lots of data at the time. We tried to do 2 years ago, we raised money in Sitryx. Again, at that point, our lead asset, this Attack-innate mimetic, was going to, we thought was moving to Lilly, and it did, about the same time we raised the cash. So our other assets were all pre-development candidate. So it was a lot harder to get traction when you're in that space than some of the traction we're getting now, because we're in the process of raising Series B right now. We kicked that off at JP Morgan, where we're just entering the clinic with our lead asset. Just attracts a different group of investors. So whilst most of our investors are UK based, or European based actually, we do have Longwood in the US, and then our strategics, actually both of our board members from Lilly and GSK are US based. What we would like to do is build more, add to our current syndicate with a US investor. And I think one of the challenges we have in Europe is the number of those investors with the deeper pockets who can help you ultimately in crossover rounds and then through an IPO and potentially then trade once you are an IPO. It's not that there's none in Europe, there are some, but there's just less. So getting some of those bigger US investors in will be, again, nice validation for us with other investors we might want in a crossover round and towards IPO. But also just having those to get deeper pockets that can stay with us on the journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then you mentioned earlier getting into the clinic, which is incredible, super exciting. What does that mean in terms of changes for the company, and what else is to come?
Yeah, so the company, like many companies, was set up originally just with all preclinical scientists. And they've done a fantastic job, been really productive actually, because we have the Attack-innate compound that I mentioned that's with Lilly. We now have the PKM2 program, hopefully moving to the clinic very soon. And then we have another program behind it, an MTHFD2 program that is about a year behind, just heading into pre-IND enabling, and then actually 2 others. So they've been a really, really productive team. But as you move to the clinic, you need a different set of skills within the company. So we brought on a CMO a couple of years ago, part-time, which was really helpful to really, and Ravi Rao is the name of our CMO, experience from Roche, GSK, academic rheumatologist originally, but has also worked in biotech with Sobi and others. And Ravi was really instrumental in the team moving from fundamental biology to how are you building your translational story, how are you thinking about the right disease indication, some of the things we were talking about earlier. And then he has really helped build out this development team. It all sits within his group there. So we've now built that team out. And actually one of the things that was tough for the team, but actually they did a fantastic job last year, was really as we were recruiting the team, we were also putting together our IND package, or in this case CTA package, for that lead program. So they were very much building that program, that package, as the team was starting to fall into place. So it was a lot of work for those guys, but they did it. They met their timelines, and now we're in a good place. So the other reflection there is it does shift the balance in the company a little bit. A lot of the people there's a few people who've been here right from the start, and they're very used to everything being very researchy, everything shared all the time, very transparent, and we'd like to keep those important parts of our culture. However, when you're getting towards the clinic, there's certain things you can't be as transparent about, and also there's these other people with very different skill sets who are now sitting alongside them. So there is a cultural change there. That's something that Fiona, who's our head of people in HR, has worked really hard on, setting up company events so people can get to know each other, trying to blur those boundaries and have the team really work well together. And I think that's absolutely working, but it's always a change. It's always a change in focus and a change in culture as you bring different skill sets in, and there's other stuff going on that people don't perhaps fully understand from the original team.
I think it's good that you're thinking like that as well. I think sometimes the cultural aspects can maybe be forgotten.
Yeah.
And having someone like Fiona who can fully concentrate on those changes and blurring them, as you said, I think, which is good terminology, is so important.
Yeah.
As well, first time CEO at Sitryx. How's that been for you? Has there been surprises, or what's it been like?
So it's been a really it's a fun but interesting experience as well. So I joined as CSO. I've been a CSO previously, and then looked after preclinical and clinical groups in big pharma. But CEO is quite a different job. Neil Weir, who's the previous CEO, was really generous in how he was exposing me to lots of the CEO role. When I was in the CSO job, and it was always part of a succession plan. So Neil's still involved. He's a fantastic mentor for me in this role, and so on. But there's nothing quite like actually suddenly being the person who's responsible. She I'm still definitely on a learning curve. It was middle of last year when we made the transition. But I guess some of the reflections are just the breadth of the role, and that you're always on, because CSO are very focused on driving forward our portfolio, managing the scientific team and so on. And every so often there's fires to fight there, but you fight those and you have a quiet period.
Yeah.
When you're the CEO, you seem to solve one fire there, and then there'll be another one somewhere else, another one, in finance or people or whatever it might be. But it's been a fun experience to learn a lot more about the financial side of the company, the financial sides of the markets, and the trends in the markets, and so on and so forth. I think the other things you learn quite quickly, you have to delegate more. You have to do that as a CSO, but there's always a temptation that you've got your experience, the piece you feel most comfortable with, sitting in project meetings, looking at the science, and realise actually you can't do as much of that. You need to be there for the key decisions and so on, but delegate a lot of that to others and step away. You have to give yourself a little bit, otherwise you're not scratching the science itch. But to find that balance has been all part of the learning curve. But again, I've been really lucky having Neil. He's fantastic, and we have regular one-to-ones and talk through the company strategy, where we're going, and so on. But others as well. Pierre Legault's our chairman. He's been super helpful for me in directing things, and then old contacts through other CEOs. Actually, there's nothing quite like talking to other CEOs. And one of the people I've chatted to a few times is Kevin Lee from Bicycle. Used to work with Kevin at Pfizer. He was at GSK then when he came to Pfizer. And before I took the role, I sat down with him to get some advice, and pretty much everything he said's come true. So I need to sit down with him again soon and just reflect on the last few months and how that's been going. So I look forward to doing that.
I think that shows it all as well. Like I've asked people for advice who are, much later in their career than I am, and like what advice would you give? And it's like mentors are so important. Keeping those connections, don't be afraid to ask for advice, and that's just all proof of it, basically. I found the same was true when I was at Pfizer. Actually, I had various mentors that
Pfizer has all sorts of mentoring programs and things, which are great.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'd really mesh with somebody who was a mentor for you, and other times not so much. And there was one particular lady, Brenda Cooperstone, she's pretty senior at Pfizer, and she's a completely different part of the organisation to me, but our relationship stayed for years and years till I left. Actually, and still keep in contact every so often, because it was just so helpful to have someone to chat to. So I always encourage people. Think about mentor relationships. Try a few out, because sometimes the chemistry's there, sometimes it's not. But when you find somebody where the chemistry's there, super valuable to have that safe space to raise different thoughts.
Is that, like, as a mentor, do you think of someone who would give you advice, like, in your career, but also outside of your career as well? Is there that aspect as well, or not so much?
Yeah. Well, the advice is rarely technical advice, really, I would say. It's more about how you're thinking about dealing with different situations.
Yeah.
And that can certainly blur into your personal life. It's really important that you have, in my view, some time that's away from work. I think if you work 24/7, it's probably not clever. You're not finding the right balance there at all. So I guess you can blur that way to a degree about, well, this is how you should think about balancing your work life appropriately with your social life, but also things you can do by mistake that can make other people feel under pressure that you don't want to highlight. So a good example of that is when I was living in the States. My daughter was a really big swimmer, so she used to go to practice early on a Saturday morning. I would drive her into Cambridge where she had her practices. So like 7:30 in the morning, I'm sat in a coffee shop. So I'd usually just work through a bunch of emails and do other things. If I start sending those out, then people feel obliged when they look at their email or their phone or something to start responding to you. So you learn little things like that. Well, actually, I'll time them so they all go out at 9 o'clock on Monday, because I don't need a response to it. I'm just doing this because I'm sat with a coffee. It's a quiet time for me to work through things. So there, perhaps the sort of elements that perhaps have come up in mentoring discussions, how people have balanced these pieces. But yeah, it's less direct functional work and more about behaviours and managing situations, in my experience.
That's interesting. Yeah. And then finally, I know you've thought about this question a little bit, and it's one we ask all our guests now. If you could have dinner with any scientist or innovator, past or present, who would it be and why?
Yeah, I thought about this one quite a lot, actually, because I thought it was quite a challenging one. So I've got a quick answer, and then I've got another one, which so I'm going to give you two people. So the obvious person for an immunologist is Edward Jenner. So he was, in the 1700s, he was the guy who noticed that cowmaids who'd had cowpox didn't get smallpox. So he was at the father of this whole vaccination story, and did an experiment which ethically was probably questionable, where he injected a small boy with some pus from the cowpox, and then showed that when he gave him smallpox he didn't die. But anyway, he really was the father of the whole vaccination approach, and this drove the whole immunology approach. So I think chatting to him to think what he was thinking, how he thought that worked, given we know so much more now, would be fascinating. But the other person I was going to mention, who's not strictly a scientist, more of a historian, but does study human behaviour, is a guy called Rutger Bregman. He's written a book called Humankind that I've recently read.
Okay.
And what it's all about is the nature of people, that we often assume the worst of people. The news often tends to focus on that. But actually, we're largely good. And there's all this evidence for this. And the reason this is really interesting to me is science and drug discovery is really hard. Right? Just the scientific stuff's hard. There's so many ways you can fail. But it's incredibly important we get it right. Because if we deliver drugs to patients that change their lives, then there's nothing quite like that. I mean, that can fundamentally change the future for people, and that's super important. The times I've found that we've been able to get through the scientific challenges are when the teams have worked fantastically well together, and that's all about humans. So science is hard, humans are harder, and I think if the more we can understand how each other tick and assume best intent or good intent from others, the better we can work together as teams, and that gives us the chance to make drugs. So I think he'd be a fascinating guy just to sit down and chat to about some of the different dynamics I've seen at different points through my career, or socially or whatever, and get his take on it. But I'd recommend that book to anybody. I think it's a really interesting book.
Yeah, that's an incredible answer. I love that.
Thanks.
Look, thanks so much for letting us down here and doing this with you.
Well, thanks for coming, and thanks for the opportunity to chat to you on your podcast.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed it.
And everyone, please like and subscribe to the BioHub. Thank you very much, Iain.
Thanks.